Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this ISAT webinar. My name's Duncan Stonehouse. I'm the head of school at Bangkok Prep, but I'm also the co-chair on ISAT for professional development. And this is one in a series of webinars that ISAT are providing online. And the rationale behind it initially was the fact that we had COVID and it wasn't possible for people to come into a big hotel or a ballroom and experience some high quality CPD. But also it's been extremely useful, and the feedback from our ISAT schools that are in the provinces is that it's hugely cost effective. It's free and there's no need for schools, maybe smaller schools that have a slightly smaller professional development budget. They don't need to go on a plane and travel somewhere and stay in a hotel. They have access online for high quality CPD. So I'm delighted there are so many people coming today, and I think that's a reflection on the subject that Emma's going to be talking about a bit later on. So welcome everybody. If I can ask you at the moment to make sure that you stay muted, apart from Emma, so that you, and if you did have any questions, maybe type some of them into the chat, and possibly if they're not covered, it may be possible for Emma to pick up a few questions at the end on the chat forum. So thank you very much for coming. This is a focus on international and interculturalism, and Emma and I have spoken a bit about this topic before, and we are, I think, as international educators, more so than maybe if I'd be back in the UK, I'd be very UK centric. It's incredibly important that we understand the international dimension of the schools that we're working in, and it's also important, I think, and Emma may be exploring this a bit further in her webinar. It's important that we put aside some of the assumptions that we may or may not have about different cultures and diversity and equality. So I won't steal any more of Emma's thunder. Emma is an amazing scientist. She's a fabulous colleague to work with. I'm slightly biased. The range of webinars are being shared by a range of different teachers from all across the schools in ISAT, and you may or may not have colleagues already that have taken part or led a webinar or are about to lead a webinar. So, but Emma is actually at my school, so I'm delighted on behalf of Bangkok Prep that Emma can represent us today and share her wisdom and her thoughts on internationalism and interculturalism. So she's also a teacher of my daughter, who now has a huge love for science, which is fantastic because she's 11. Emma's an amazing teacher. She's actually has a real passion for interculturalism, and she's in the kind of the mid to final stages of her PhD. So please enjoy and listen carefully to what Emma's got to say, and feel free to ponder that. I think many of these webinars allow us to reflect on our own context and our own professional situation, and hopefully the webinars enable people to develop their practice and their situation. It has a direct benefit on the students that we work with. So Emma, I'll hand over to you. Thank you very much in advance for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for such a lovely, warm introduction to our English first language colleagues. Hello, welcome, thank you everyone. I'm looking at the faces here of many of our host nation and our Southeast Asian colleagues, in which case, Sawadika, forgive my appalling pronunciation. As Duncan was saying, one of the main things that we're going to talk about is communication, and it's how we can work together amongst ourselves, with our host nation colleagues, with our colleagues of other nationality. And while I'm just screen sharing, if you bear with me a second, this is like the start of one of my Zoom lessons. Can you see me? Am I sharing? Okay. Now, the title of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is the idea of learning interculturally. And now we went back and forward about what the best title for this would be. And we thought, let's keep it actually deliberately vague, because we're going to talk about the way our students learn, the way that us as teachers learn, the way that we as people working outside of a culture that's maybe our own learn, and how this can impact upon our classroom. So, okay, Quick overview of what we're going to be talking about, and it's very much going to be sort of skimming over a lot of much deeper, larger issues. And you will find my email at the end of this presentation. I do genuinely welcome conversation, and be it in the chat or follow-up conversations via email. I'll be touching sort of at a surface level on a lot of bigger, deeper issues, things that we're certainly working through as a team at PrEP, and things that you might have seen in terms of the way CIS are changing their accreditation standards, things that sort of as international educators, a journey that we're going on. Okay, so one of the first things I'd like to open with is our mission and vision statements here at PrEP. And we're talking about obviously being outstanding learning communities, but we're acknowledging the environment that we are working in, this very unique environment, unique worldwide and unique here in Bangkok, because all of the international schools, and there's a huge number of schools as we know, these international schools, each school is representative of a very different context in terms of the curriculums we offer, but most importantly, in terms of who we're staffed by and what our student demographic represents. So the question that we actually as staff went through a period of reflection and are continuously reflecting on, and what hopefully you as educators will be reflecting on during this presentation, is what does it mean to be an international school? What does this idea of being internationally minded actually mean? And it's not something that I or probably any one of us is able to define, because it means so many things simultaneously. And I think it's a case of, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to your educational setting and your students? So if we open up with those of us that are from international schools, IB schools, you're probably very familiar with the work of George Walker, and quite a famous quote actually, which was the idea that we as international schools aren't necessarily clear of what our own mission and vision actually means and how we go about implementing this thing called an international education. So confusion over the definition and goal, it doesn't help us deliver effective internationally minded education, particularly not if we're sure what that actually means. And it's the idea of an international schools moving beyond the 5Fs, the food, the flags, the festivals, etc., and making sure that our education is something much more meaningful. Can I just give you a photograph to ponder on for a while? Have a look at this particular image, and it's an image taken at International Day, something that we've actually moved away from, and we talk about something called an internationally minded day, an internationally minded week. So we're going through a process of evolution with this. I want you to have a look at the photograph and think about what this photograph represents. And if I can just give you something else to consider here. The child on the right, she's actually mine, and she'd be mortified if she knew that I was sharing this photograph with you. And this is a child that looks incredibly happy. She's clearly having super fun with her friends, and that's what the photograph suggests. And forgive me getting a little emotional as I talk about this, because actually that wasn't what was happening inside that child. My little Aria, and I'm looking at some of the names, I think a few of you actually teach her. She was born in Kuwait, and she moved to Thailand when she was 18 months old. This is a child, if you think about her parentage, I'm half Scottish, half Italian. Her father was raised in Papua New Guinea. She doesn't identify as British at all. She carries a British passport, but has never lived in the country. You ask her what England is, it's where grandma lives. And this particular day, International Day for her, was quite traumatic. She came home quite upset by the day, actually, because if you ask her how she identifies, we sent her to Thai nursery, so for quite a while she was actually Thai first language, and she identifies as Thai. And the little girl that's in the photograph with her here is her best friend, and her mother is very much my source of a lot of the knowledge I have of the host nation. And so her friend came and stood with her by this Union Jack as an act of solidarity, because my child, who identifies actually now as a global citizen. We have quite lengthy discussions about this because she is going through a process of identity work, as are many of our international students. This particular day, she had a Union Jack hoisted in her hand, a flag she doesn't identify with, and she was asked to go and stand with the Union Jack in the International Day Parade. And for her, it was a day not of celebration of culture, it was a day of segregation. It was a day where it was made explicitly clear that she was different to her friends, that she was different to her peers, and not a great success, actually. So that takes me to this model that I'm sure many of you will have seen before, but this has led to very detailed, very good discussion with our students during our PSHE programme of this idea of a cultural iceberg. So for those of you that haven't seen this model before, maybe not this form, it's the idea of what a child is expressing in the classroom, their behaviours, their practices, the fact that you could go back and you could look at my child and see a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child and instantly make assumptions about that child. These are what's observable. And there are so many deep things going on inside the students that we're teaching and inside ourselves actually as educators as well. For those of you that have been overseas for a large period of time, you might find that you're going through a process of identity work. You might find that some aspects of your own culture are changing and evolving to fall more in line with the wider culture that you're working in. This led me to do some work, some of which for my research, but some for personal reading, into this idea then of a collaborative intelligence. And the idea then of, so we've heard of obviously IQ, and we've heard of EQ, the idea of emotional intelligence, and then we've heard of, or maybe some of us have talked about CQ, something that's gaining massive momentum in business. So the idea of, as the world is globalizing, actually training and learning and developing the skills to be able to work in this sort of multicultural environment. Collaborative intelligence is another one then, which goes specifically into developing the skills to work with and understand the strengths of those around us that aren't necessarily from the same culture as us. And it's a brilliant book. I highly recommend it. And one of the things that the authors asked, they did a large survey as they were starting to write the book, and they asked this question here, which is, well, what are some of the biggest challenges when you are working in a multicultural environment? And now, if I may just make the distinction here between multicultural, the number of different nationalities, the number of different identities prevalent in our particular setting, versus the idea of being intercultural, which is certainly the direction, the journey that we're taking our school into. The idea of going beyond, we've just got lots of different identities, to actually understanding, respecting and learning from the other cultures. What were some of the biggest challenges then of working in a multicultural environment? And the resounding answer that came back was, it's working with other people. The challenges I'm facing is communication with other people. So let's think about what is so challenging then about working with other people in an environment such as that we find many of us in, where we've got students and colleagues and parents in the wider community being representative of all of these different cultures. Johns Hopkins University have just started, literally in the last year or so, have just started a course looking at working with diversity and actually embracing and learning from diversity. And if we have a look here, this is what they call their diversity wheel. And these are some of the challenges that we will be facing when we're working in these environments. And one of the things that is beyond the scope of this particular webinar now, but one of the things that is becoming prevalent in research is the idea of confronting our own bias, actually being open and honest and going through a period of self-reflection. What aspects of the diversity, what aspects of this sort of diverse community that we're working in am I comfortable with? what work do I need to do? What am I ignorant of? What aspects of diversity do I just not acknowledge? Now, moving on then, we did some training in our particular school where we talked about this idea of intercultural conflict, not necessarily conflict as in physically shouting and getting cross with each other, but examples of when something's not quite gone right, where we've had discussions, we've had meetings where we've been frustrated with the outcome. Or if I may give a personal example, when you've moved overseas with your toolkit of lesson plans and successful lessons and these wonderful bits of pedagogy that have been working fabulously, for you to then suddenly replicate that particular lesson in a completely different cultural context to find that lesson doesn't work. Activities that I would be using in, I used to teach at a sort of inner city comprehensive in the Midlands, and the students loved shouting out answers, loved debate, getting out of their seat and coming sort of playing splat games on the board and things like this. Those were fantastic lessons. I tried to then replicate these lessons whilst I was teaching in Southeast Asia, to be met by sort of blank stares, large eyes, and the students not particularly engaging with that particular style of teaching. Where are these causes of conflict coming from? And most importantly, how can we move on? So I'm going to split how intercultural conflict, where it comes from, into three main things, three main categories. Ethnocentrism, differences in our cultural values, and then cultural communication practices. So the first one, an idea of an ethnocentrism. Now, the Bennett scale, so Bennett's model of intercultural sensitivity, this is sort of a sliding scale, moving maybe from the position that many of us found moving into a new culture for the first time, and this process that we can go through, and all of us here are going to be at different places on this scale, how we can move from what was initially an ethnocentric mindset to what we're moving to, ideally a more ethno-relative mindset, where we're moving from an idea of the training I've had, that I'm British trained, this works in the classroom, these ideas work in the classroom, moving to a stage where we actually find ourselves truly integrating and appreciating and having respect for the culture that we're teaching in. Now, if we have a look at this scale here, I'll give you a moment to have a read through it in your own time. I've been overseas for probably coming up to about 12 or 13 years now, and it's only really been maybe the past 2 or 3 years that I've felt I've moved into this stage of adaptation. This first became clear to me when I went back to the UK for a holiday and realised actually that no longer felt home. I was going back to the UK to see my family rather than I was going home. I've certainly yet not made it truly into this integration stage yet. It's something I'm aiming for. And, you know, most of us will be somewhere on this sliding scale. Some of us that are fairly new to international teaching may still find ourselves in the earlier stages, where we still believe that Western education, because of the nature of its transferable qualifications, is the best education system. I've taught at a BSO school where we were directly, deliberately marketing that, the best of British, where we believed that the British ways were the best. I mean, how far you sit on that scale also is reflective of what the vision of your particular school is as well. And again, coming back to the idea of bias, what you perceive an international education to be. I will caution you towards this sort of ethnocentric, this hidden curriculum. And something I talk a lot about in my research is the idea of, yes, many of our students, many of our host nation communities, our parents. Yes, they want a British qualification. Yes, we want the acquisition of English. Yes, we want qualifications that are transferable. But be mindful of what level sort of that stops. Are we then going beyond that? Are we expecting our students to be exhibiting more sort of Western patterns of behaviour? What do we perceive as being desirable behaviour? Do we want our students to be modelling sort of a more Western mindset? Because that's where we're moving into the territory of a hidden curriculum. And I think it's something we need to be mindful of. Now, the second thing we can do then to avoid cultural conflict, it's this idea of being aware of the difference in cultural values. And after having had a period of time where I was finding that activities that I was bringing with me from the UK actually didn't seem to be working as well in this new cultural setting, that's when I started doing some work, doing some reading into the idea of, well, is there something underpinning this? Why was it that my students in the UK seemed to be very comfortable questioning, shouting out, debating, making suggestions? And actually, that I found to still be the case when I was teaching in the Middle East. I was teaching in Kuwait, and I found, again, there, the students seemed very comfortable, very comfortable to question me, to ask questions, to get actively involved in verbal discussions. And then I found that moving to Southeast Asia, this is the second school I've taught in Southeast Asia, I found the students on the whole, and yes, I'm generalising, but I found the students on the whole can be a lot quieter, don't seem to feel as comfortable speaking out loud in class, don't seem to feel as comfortable verbally asking questions. And I started thinking, well, is there a reason for this? And that's what took me into some of the work, some of the research that I've done into cultural dimensions and cultural values. A lot of what I'll talk about today is going to be specifically the sort of East-West mindset, because that's relevant to our settings. But if anyone would like to have a follow-up discussion about other cultures, I'd really enjoy that discourse. A book that I would like to recommend here, and I'm certain that some people in our webinar today will have read it, is The Geography of Thought. And this particular book, it was one of the first books recommended to me when I expressed an interest in wanting to get more into the East-West mindset. And in this particular book, what Richard Nisbet was doing was really exploring the perceptions, the thought processes, the assumptions of a Western mindset and an Eastern mindset. And what he concluded was that there were very strong psychological and social differences between the thought processes of someone who was sort of Western born and educated versus someone who's been raised in a Southeast Asian culture. Now, I particularly liked this thought experiment. It was an experiment that he did on literally thousands of his students at one of the universities that he worked at. And if I talk you through the experiment, it's a nice example of this thought process. So he took his students, many students from East Asian background, many students from a Western background, and he showed them these three photographs. And so we've got the photograph of the cow, we've got the photograph of the grass, we've got the photograph of the duck. And what he asked was, can you find the pairings? Which pictures go together? Which picture is the odd one out? And left his students to sort of cogitate this, have a think about this, and then feedback with their conclusions. So before I share his conclusions with you, just have a look at these three images yourself. Consider how you would group them. Does the cow go with the grass? Does the duck go with the grass? Do the cow and the duck go together? Just have a think. Okay. Were we in person, I'd maybe do a show of hands, because having replicated this particular experiment in training sessions, each time I've done this, I found the results to be in line with what Nisbet found. which was, if we ask sort of our Western colleagues how you would categorise them, they put the cow and the duck together. It became literally an act of categorisation. These are living things. These are living, breathing things. They go together. Whereas many of our East Asian colleagues were categorising the cow with the grass. We're focusing more on this harmonious sort of relationship, more sort of a holistic focus. Well, the cow requires the grass to live. And then after the cow has eaten the grass, the cow will then pass the, will then do what cows do, which will then go into the ground, which will then act to fertilise the grass. And we're thinking about it more sort of holistically. An interesting point coming from that as well, language itself. I don't know if we've noticed differences in how different groups of students, different cultural groupings will learn language. With our Southeast Asian learners leaning towards putting things into context, I'll come on to the idea of a collectivist culture later. Our Southeast Asian learners tend to learn verbs as easily as they learn nouns. And this was a discussion I was having with a language teacher, whereas for some of our students from a Western background, that's not necessarily the case. Okay, now, let's talk about our third thing then, that we should consider working in an international environment. And that's the idea then of cultural communication. And again, I'm going to use another photograph. It's the last one. I'm not going to take this as an opportunity to show you all of my family photographs. What we've got here, we've got an image that I think sort of expresses some of the challenges that we can face communicating with our students, communicating with our colleagues, communicating with the wider community. Cultural communication can be quite challenging, certainly communicating across cultures. And the photograph that I've chosen to use here is actually the photograph from my daughter's socially distanced birthday party. And normally for her birthday, we'll have all of her friends over, but last year, for obvious reasons, we said, no, we can't have all of your class over. That's socially responsible. So choose your just choose some of your closest friends from school. So here's my daughter in the middle with her best friends from school. And they came over and we had a lovely time. We made slime, we had cake, all the sorts of things you would do at a birthday party. And it all went swimmingly until it was time to leave. And that's when it got terribly, terribly awkward. The scenario we've got here, so the girl on the left, her parents are Thai. The girl next to her, so the one with the dinosaur mask on her head, it was a dinosaur themed party, my daughter's choice. So the one with the dinosaur mask, she is sisters with the girl on the right with the denim jacket. Their family are dad's half Portuguese, half Chinese. Mum is half English, half Thai. And the parents there have studied in Europe, at international schools in Thailand. They're very worldly. And then the little girl at the back in the sort of beige coloured t-shirt, her parents also are Thai and they're non-English speaking Thai. So we were having communication issues there anyway. So as I said, it came to the end of the party and it was time for us to leave. And that's when it just became terribly awkward. The parents of the little girls who were from the more Western background thanked us profusely. Great big hug, great big cuddle. And the parents from the sort of more traditional Thai background sort of stood there. Wide the other Thai parents, nice deep white, looked at us and it was sort of that moment of we froze. What do we do? We're from different cultures. Do we why? Do we shake hands? We shouldn't be shaking hands because we're socially distancing. It all got terribly awkward anyway. And it actually took for my daughter to go up to all the sets of parents, give them a great big why, thank them for coming in Thai, at which point everyone started whying each other, and then we could leave and we could finish the day. But it was just that moment of sort of, I don't know if you've had it at parents' evening, where do we shake hands? Do we why? And And how do we avoid these awkward situations? I had another one teaching in the Middle East. In the Middle East, I was teaching physics, and for a start, many of the parents were quite shocked that their son, the Kuwaiti boys have to do physics, by the way, so there's all sorts of interesting dynamics there, not just in terms of culture, but in terms of gender. And many of the parents questioned multiple times, "You're my son's physics teacher?" "Yes, yes, I teach physics." "You teach physics?" And so that was awkward anyway. But I remember at parents' evening, my first parents' evening, going up and attempting to shake hands with many of the fathers, and then same idea, it got terribly awkward because I, as a woman, should not have been even offering to touch the hand of a married man. And I thought at the time, had I actually done some research into the culture, that would have avoided these really, really awkward interactions. So that's what we're going to move on to next, how we can maybe develop some of our skills of cultural communication. Okay, so coming back to the idea of CQ, so cultural intelligence. I highly recommend the Cultural Intelligence Centre. And now it's not necessarily educational based. The Cultural Intelligence Centre talks more about making the most of the assets that you have within a company, actually making the most of the fact that you've got all these viewpoints and you've got this different knowledge from all of the different cultures within your environment, which is clearly applicable to international school settings. And it's the idea of cultural intelligence. It's the idea of actually moving beyond what we earlier called this sort of Eurocentric mindset, and realizing actually maybe what I'm doing in this particular context isn't right. Maybe I do need to adapt. Maybe I do need to change in response to the people I'm surrounded with in this particular setting. Now, if we just focus specifically on these different cultures, going back maybe to what we were talking about with Nisbet's experiment, where we highlighted the idea that a Southeast Asian mindset is actually fundamentally different to a Western mindset. I started looking into Hofstede's dimensions of culture. And I don't know whether this is something you're familiar with or not, and it's certainly beyond the scope of this webinar to talk about defining culture. It's not a definition that I've actually managed to fine-tune yet. But what Hofstede tells us, or his definition of culture, was it's the collective programming of the mind, and it distinguishes the members of one group from another. And here I would like to say, obviously we're very conscious and we're very aware of the word race. And there's a lot being written now in the idea of racial equality and racial equity. To acknowledge, though, that people of different cultural groupings and different races are different, that is not racist. That's what I define as cultural intelligence. To appreciate that maybe your Korean learners have got a different set of needs to your American learners, may therefore exhibit different behaviours in the classroom, that's not racist, that's culturally intelligent. On which note, let's have a look at some of the dimensions. So, sorry, coming back to Hofstede. Hofstede was a managing director for IBM, and he started to notice, similar to what we've just discussed, the idea that maybe different groups of people were behaving in a way that was very different to what he was used to. And what he did was he set out on a humongous piece of research, and his research, the first research, span over nearly a decade. And what he did was he interviewed and sent out surveys to 117,000 employees at IBM. And the idea was he was looking to fine-tune his cross-cultural communication across this large multinational company. And he came up with initially 4 what he called dimensions of culture, ways that cultures are different, or scales that different cultures sit on. And this work was then picked up by the World Values Survey, and then later the Confucian Values Survey. And it was only about, I think, 8 years ago, the last dimension of culture, and that was the work of Michnoff, who's on the bottom of the book. I think this was one of Hostey's latest books. He came up with these 6 major dimensions of culture. And I think understanding these dimensions of culture gives us a greater understanding of maybe the situations that manifest in our own classrooms. So, in no particular order, these are some of the dimensions of culture then that he discussed. And now, Hofstede did come up against some criticism for stereotyping. And I agree we should not be stereotyping. As I was saying to my students earlier, not all British people drink tea, for example. Many British people do, though. And being aware of stereotypes, yes, we don't want to stereotype, but being aware of where some of these stereotypes come from, being aware of some of the general sort of traits of general cultural groups does lead us some way towards a greater understanding of the needs of our learners. So, with not wanting to stereotype in mind, let's have a look at some of these cultural dimensions. So, power distance. Power distance really opened my eyes to why, in this particular Southeast Asian context, my students didn't seem particularly comfortable speaking out in class, certainly didn't seem particularly comfortable questioning me. I made a mistake the other day in a quite involved calculation week, the year 13. I was quite tired, sort of zoomed out, and I made a mistake, and not a single one of my incredibly talented year 13s raised the mistake I'd made. And the amount of times I've heard colleagues say things like, they need to learn to ask questions. They need to be willing to challenge me. Well, maybe there's a reason why that's not happening, and maybe we as educators need to think about different ways to facilitate that questioning. Anyway, I'll come back to that later. So, a culture that is of high power resistance accepts a hierarchy, accepts they have a place within that hierarchy, and that doesn't need justifying. People maybe of a low power distance aren't comfortable with that notion. A position of power needs to be earned and want to seek justifications. The individual versus collectivist culture, Confucian culture and the Southeast Asian culture, very, very collective cultures. Society, these larger holistic relationships, thinking about the community, much more so than a more individualistic culture that focuses on themselves. And I don't mean that's a negative thing. Sort of some cultures are more driven towards being go-getters, whereas some cultures are conditioned, for want of a better word, to work collectively to think of the greater good of the society. Masculine versus feminine, actually nothing to do with male, female, more to do with a masculine society being assertive, not quite aggressive, but again, this idea of go-getting, versus a more feminine society, which value more the traits of being modest, not standing out. You may have noticed already that some of your students seem to really enjoy getting the house points and this sort of celebration of their achievements, whereas some students tend to shy away from that a little bit and become a little bit more almost embarrassed about standing out. Other ones then, we've got the uncertainty avoidance, the long-term orientation, and the very latest one that was added, which is the indulgence versus restraint. I'm going to leave these on the slides. I didn't focus much of my research on these three as much as the previous three. but they are here if you want to read over them. What's interesting is then, if you think about, maybe have a look at your initial origin, maybe have a think about our host nation, and maybe start to draw some comparisons. So I was born and raised in the UK, and then if I compare the UK here then, so a UK which has got much lower power distance when we compare that. So if we look at Southeast Asia on the map, these were cultures then that express a much larger power distance. And if we think about students giving respect for the teacher, students being more willing to challenge the teacher, or students not being willing to challenge and question the teacher, actually it could be in part put down to power distance. A Southeast Asian learner who is quiet in class and doesn't ask questions, not out loud verbally, that student, I mean, I initially came to this country thinking, why won't these students ask me questions? Why are these students disengaged? They weren't, they're not disengaged. And when I actually had this discourse with the students on a more one-to-one basis, it was my students that explained to me, actually, it's a respect thing. I don't want to in class point out a mistake you've made. I don't want to question what you've taught in class for fear of showing disrespect towards you as a teacher. So there are deeper meanings, deeper things about the culture of the students we're teaching that I'd just caution you to question. The other one that I found to be a quite large impact in this particular teaching environment is the individual versus collectivist society. And we've already discussed the fact that Southeast Asian culture tends to be a more collectivist society. Whereas certainly where I was in the UK, it was an expected, it was almost a desirable behaviour to be go-getting, to raise your head above the crowd, to have your voice heard, whereas not so much in a collectivist culture. I'll come on to that in more detail after. Now, Hofstede has got a very interesting website where you can sort of type in the different cultures, different cultural groupings, and you can make culture comparisons. So I typed in the 3 main cultures that are prevalent in my particular classrooms. And bear in mind, this changes on a year-by-year basis. So I'm finding I'm having to adapt my pedagogy on a year-by-year basis. But what was quite interesting was, coming back to what we saw on the map, in terms of individualism, so our Thai students compared to our students from the UK clearly is a much more individualist culture. So what you might observe in the classroom is your techniques where you want students to speak out, where you, the closed questioning. Do you have a question? Can you give me an answer? You might find that your students from the more collectivist cultures aren't engaging with that so much. I'll come back to the classroom specific examples after this particular table I've got here. Now, I would like to thank my host nation colleagues here for helping me to sort of translate some of this. But a book I would highly recommend, and it was given to me as a gift, is written by Feng Sak, and apologies for my appalling pronunciation. Now, it's a name you might be familiar with. He wrote a wonderful blog in the Bangkok Post. He's Thai and a business manager, and he wrote a wonderful blog which was talking about bridging the gap between Western businessmen and Asian businessmen, and it was quite amusing actually. A lot of it was written through humour, and it gave various anecdotes about where these communications went wrong. And having read it, I could a lot of it I could relate to, and I could certainly see a lot of what he was talking about reflected in things that have happened in my own classroom, where I've sort of sat back reflexively and gone, well, that didn't work, did it? Okay, what can I try next time? So One of the sort of final conclusions in his book, and he gives lots of examples, but is this particular table. And again, for our host nation colleagues, I apologise if I've not quite translated the Thai correctly here. But there's some really interesting differences here. And I think it might explain some of the things that manifest, as I said, in our own classroom. So whereas sort of in the West, it's seen as a good personality trait to be assertive, to be a good go-getter, not so much for our Southeast Asian colleagues. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move down to the last one, and then we'll talk about how this manifests in terms of activities. But another one, again, something that seems to be drummed into a lot of those of us coming from the West is good business, a good working environment is to be very focused, very serious. And I've observed scenarios where colleagues have become frustrated by some of our, sort of Southeast Asian colleagues laughing and joking, and maybe that could be perceived as not taking the work so seriously. That's certainly something that I've experienced in the classroom. Seeing groups of my Southeast Asian learners, and I do allow my students to sit, incidentally, in cultural groupings, and I think it helps with language, but maybe laughing and joking, and I myself have got frustrated, you're clearly not taking your work or your learning seriously. And actually, it's something about the Southeast Asian culture, the idea of forming community relationships and trying to make the work fun and trying to involve as many people of the community within the task as possible. It comes back down to this collective idea. Now, again, I'm mindful of time, so I have shared these slides with you. There are then some specific examples of how this manifests in your classroom. And so a big one for me was the sort of collectivist idea. Students that maybe are quite quiet and quite reserved, students that this just closed questioning doesn't work for, you've probably seen move to a group activity and these particular students just suddenly come alight. And again, that could be brought back to the idea of students of collectivist culture, feeling much more comfortable working in a collective environment, a group environment. Okay, now the point that I'll finish this section of the presentation with is the idea then that with all of this in mind, with this cultural understanding in mind, let's try and change our mindset. The amount of times I've seen report statements saying that a child is disengaged, but basing that on the fact that the child is very, very quiet in the classroom. Maybe the child isn't disengaged. Maybe it's just a case that the child is differently engaged or is engaged in a way that is very different to what we would expect being from our own particular culture. I mean, again, if I can very quickly share a personal experience there. I describe myself as being a highly functioning, but I'm an introvert, a complete introvert. And one of the things that was often written on my school reports was some of the statements I've seen written on some of our Asian students' reports. Should speak out more in class, should ask more questions, needs to be more engaged in lessons. And that's something I completely empathise with. Just because a child is not quiet, a child's quiet, just because a child's not constantly verbally engaging with you, it certainly doesn't mean they're disengaged. Maybe they just don't feel comfortable engaging in the way that you expect them to. Okay, now that takes me to sort of our concluding part, the idea of, well, this leads to a paradigm shift. This leads into reevaluating what we're doing, how we're doing it. And it also leads us into, well, what does education mean? What actually is knowledge then? You may be aware, I'll just give you a second to read that before I move on. You may be aware of the sort of explosion of literature in bias, in equity, inequality, and the idea of the fact that we've got to prepare students for a world that is constantly changing. The boundaries have moved. It's not just a case of preparing students to be of benefit within our own nation state. The world is globalizing, and the skills that we need to impart to these students, it's so much more than facts, figures and knowledge. So a graphic that I found here to be very effective with my students was the idea of, well, what do we want? Equality? Is equality enough? And I think the question is, well, no. If we give every child exactly the same education, we're not tailoring that education for the specific needs of the child. And going back to that diversity wheel, going back to the cultural iceberg, that is a challenge for us as educators in this international setting. I mean, equality is a good start. I'm not saying equality is not a good thing. The idea of all students getting a high quality education, yeah, brilliant, absolutely. But we need to be prepared to tailor what we're doing to meet the needs of our students. We need to not do what I first did as a rather green educator, you know, new to international education, which was to come with my toolkit of Western biased pedagogy and expect that all of my students fit in with what I'm doing, expect that all of my students will start behaving the way that my Western students did in the UK. You know, think, well, over time, my Southeast Asian learners and my non-Western learners will start to become more outspoken. These students will start to answer out more if they spend more time in my classroom. That's moving into hidden curriculum territory, where we're starting to see students that don't necessarily fit in with our dominant ideas of what a good student is. And we start to see students that don't fit in with our paradigm of what a good student is. We're trying to fix them. And students with these different cultures, with these different ideas, these are not problems to be fixed. You know, these students are assets. These students are enabling us to get a greater cultural understanding. Okay. Now, two things then that I want you to be aware of in terms of the implications of this for our classroom. So, culturally responsive pedagogy is a good thing. What a lot of us are having to do at the moment is the sort of vertical and horizontal articulations of our curriculum. And we're also looking for ways that we can make a curriculum more accessible to all of our learners. And the idea of modifying our curriculum, so I don't know if you're familiar with sort of BAME education, so education for Black Asian learners. It's bringing in sort of books from authors of different ethnic minorities. Yes, that's good. Appreciating the culture of others, having International Day where we get to look at the national dress of other cultures and we get to try the foods of other cultures. Yes, it's good, it's a start. But what we really want to do, we want international education to go a stage further than that. And that's where the idea of social justice, what a lot of my research talks about, the idea of meaningfully including the knowledge of other cultures, the thought processes, actually starting to take on board, moving away from our ethnocentric mindset to really truly value and respect the knowledge of other cultures. So we want to move away then from just equality and move towards equity. So this particular graphic that I've got here, this, unlike the Bennett scale, we don't start at the left and move through to the right. These sort of are different things that we should be dipping in and out of in our teaching to try and make the education that we're offering equitable for all of our students. So if I just give you a second to maybe read what's in the bubbles. So I'm not saying that integration of content of other cultures is a bad thing. It's not. But we need to do more than that. That's not enough. By me mentioning the names of some scientists that aren't grey-haired, middle-aged Western men, by me mentioning some female scientists, or by me mentioning the work of some ethnic minority scientists, that doesn't mean I have decolonised the science curriculum. I'm starting to make the curriculum more accessible to students outside of sort of that majority hegemonic group, but I've not decolonised the curriculum. What we want to be doing is we want to be empowering students to be able to co-create knowledge. Instead of those outside the dominant Western paradigm just being vessels to absorb this dominant knowledge, we want the students to be in a position of social justice where they can start to challenge some of these dominant paradigms within which we work. Okay. The slide I've got here is literally just for you to follow up on. There was a wonderful podcast and a wonderful article, and I don't know if you saw it on the Times Educational Supplement, but the international version, which talked about the idea of international schools, are they too white? It was following up on the movements of sort of some university-led movements. So the Rhodes Must Fall movement, or the Why Is Our Curriculum White movement, which is very much a tertiary education. But the idea that this is starting to filter into secondary education now. Okay. The idea of, in addition to this Eurocentric thinking, we're including the knowledge of others, the thought process of others. Okay, and this is where I'm drawing to a close. So, two quotes that I like, actually. When we think about our assessments and coming back to the idea of a paradigm shift, one of the things that we talk about with the paradigm shift in education is moving away from the model of data and statistics as being the only benchmark we use to assess these students. Meekins was writing specifically actually looking at sort of the black-white dichotomy in the States, but it's applicable to the scenario that we're in here, which is the idea of when we look at achievement gaps. For example, if we talk about certain cultural groupings being maybe our EAL learners, are they underperforming in other subjects as well? Is it that these students are underperforming, or is it just that our perception of these students, we perceive them as underperforming? Is it something that we're projecting? If I take you to the Carly Sfina quote earlier, Carly talks about a particular example. So we're at a parents' evening, and you as a teacher, it's the irony of you as a teacher are relating a message to a parent that a child needs to communicate more in class. A child needs to speak more, needs to engage more. But what's actually sat in front of you is a child who is listening to what you are saying as the teacher in English, is then having to go through the thought process of translating that then into their home language so they can then translate that message back to their parent. I mean, I'm sure we've all been there where you've had a child who is having to work as an active translator during your parents' consultation. But then we say that this is a student who needs to improve their communication skills, they need to improve their language skills. This child is an asset. This child is working in their second, possibly even their third language. We need to move away from the idea that thinking this child is a problem to be solved. This child really is an asset, and there should be a co-creation of knowledge going back and forth. Okay, so what I'll leave you with here are some competencies for if we move towards this idea of teaching that is culturally responsive. A lot of it comes from collaboration, communication, which is why it's such a good thing that we're all here, you know, hundreds of us as educators from different backgrounds, different schools, representative of different identities, different curriculums. The fact that we're all here, and I'm hoping this is going to be a platform for communication back and forth. This is where it starts, just being willing to learn from each other, being willing to learn from our students, actually. My final quote then, going back to Quinsac, the man who wrote Bridging the Gap and talked about this sort of East and West conflict. Things are going to go wrong. As I've alluded to, a lot of what I discuss is based on mistakes I've made in the classroom and mistakes I continue to make in my own classroom. But it's willing to learn, it's willing to adapt, it's willing to change. And I just think he sums that up beautifully. Collaborate, we need to work with each other. See our students, not as something to be solved, but see our students as a place of knowledge, see our students as an asset in our classrooms, and hopefully we can all move forward together to create what truly is an intercultural education. Okay, I'll finish there, thank you. Now I have, here's my email address, so if anyone would like to maybe follow up, if anyone would like to discuss their own experiences, I would be delighted to have that discourse with you. Also, does anyone have any questions they'd like me now? I believe the session is due to go on until 5 o'clock, so thank you very much. I'll, of course, feel free to leave at this point, but if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, I'd be very happy to take questions.
First, would it be misleading to students if in the classroom teachers were to challenge the biased resources of the US or UK curriculum?
No, I wouldn't. I think that's actually a really good way to start to work towards this sort of social justice. It's actually something I invite my students to discuss openly. I mean, one of the things that we do talk about is the fact that students are aware that they want these transferable qualifications. But we do talk about the idea of, well, where does the curriculum come from? So obviously we need to talk about the gains of education, and, you know, that the education effectively is a product, and, you know, it's beyond the scope of this talk now, but something I talk about a lot in my research is the idea of, well, what actually is knowledge, and the fact that knowledge is, or the curriculum is designed by these sort of Western biased knowledge companies, and who gets to say what's on our curriculum and who gets to say what needs to be taught. That is sort of the bigger picture that is this sort of Western hegemony. But being willing to enter into discussions with students like that, no, I think that's really important, and it's something I certainly actively try and do during lessons like PSHE. Maybe not so much during my chemistry classes, because obviously we've got time constraints and things. But no, I think these are really important discussions to be having with the students.
Do you have any suggestions for how to respond to segregation between parents on culture?
Segregation between parents and so I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Segregation is an interesting one in terms of different cultural groupings. I'm not sure what you mean in terms of parents, but something we're very mindful of is inviting parents of the host nation to come and be actively involved in giving guest lectures. Everything we translate into multiple languages because we're trying to make it obvious to our parents that their input is incredibly valuable. Obviously, there's the almost expectation that parents will defer to us as the school, to us as the deliverers of the Western education programme, but we're trying to have more sort of parents and community meetings, allowing our wider culture to know, our parents to know that we really do value their knowledge and we do welcome their feedback. So yeah, more sort of communications with the community to make it clear that they are valued, that we do value their knowledge. I'm not sure that's really answered the question. On the topic of segregation, it is something that segregation of our students, sort of cultural groupings, is something that we're working on. It's sort of something we've got on a bit of a think tank at the moment, because we're moving away from the idea of you must speak English only. This idea of we're an English-speaking campus. Yes, English lessons are delivered through the medium of English, but a lot of research now is talking about use of home languages. And I mean, the cognitive load, if you think about what a lot of these students are doing, which is we're teaching something in English. For many of these students, they're having to take that, translate it back to their home language, then translate that back to a response back in English, and then give that answer out again in another language. The process, the cognitive load, every time a student that's not necessarily English first language has to go through to answer a question, I mean, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. Again, another reason why you might find that students of an EAL background don't seem to be so verbally responsive in lessons. So what we're experimenting with a bit more is allowing students to talk in languages other than English in the classroom, whereas in the past I've tried to bring seating plans in, so I sit sort of a Thai student, a Japanese student, an English student, to prevent sort of my Thai students all sitting over here together, my English students all grouping together. Actually, I'm experimenting more now with allowing them to group by culture through a language perspective, and I'm not sure if that's going to work or not, but yeah, the cultural groupings, it's a difficult one, particularly when you have a particular, we talk about being a multicultural school because we've got students representative of 72 different nationalities, but actually in reality of those 72 nationalities, 80% of the students are Thai. So you'll end up with sort of Thai groupings and then the grouping of the others. What do we do to encourage these students to intermingle and to break down these cultural groupings? I don't know, and it's input I would appreciate from you, because it's certainly something that we're discussing.
Is there a book you can recommend in relation to intercultural learning?
Intercultural learning, a book. There were two on the slides that I've shared with you that I highly recommend. That might be more a case of, would you like to maybe drop me an email with that question in? Because I've got a few that are saved on my computer that I can't think of off the top of my head. So I don't know, maybe if it's a case of suggested resources, I'd very much welcome an email, and then I'll respond that way. That's probably better.
Should we discuss and teach intercultural awareness explicitly to our students to raise awareness and reduce misunderstandings?
I believe so. I was in a meeting this morning where it's something that we're bringing into our PSHE curriculum explicitly. And so we were planning this morning, and now we're going to actually have it student-led as well. So it's being delivered by students from various different cultures as well. We're going to have the sixth formers delivering it to our younger students. But yes, we're going to have a specific lesson on bias. We're going to have a specific lesson on dimensions of culture. We're going to have a lesson on personality traits and strengths. I think we said we're going to have a lesson on equality versus equity. Yes, I believe it is something that should be taught explicitly. I mean, it would be nice as well to be able to bring aspects of it in during lessons. The first question we were asked during this question and answer session, can we bring it into our lessons? Is there scope? I mean, I'm a chemistry teacher, spot periodic table. I'm a chemistry teacher, and we spent a lot of time talking about sort of who takes the Nobel Prizes. We talked about when row 7 was completed, the fact that a couple of those elements came from Southeast Asian research groups. Yeah, I think it is something we should be talking about with our students. Give them ownership of their own curriculum, allow them to understand these structures. It's only when the students actually understand these power structures that we'll start to, as a society, to challenge them.
What is the proper assessment for intercultural learning?
I don't know that it is something that can be assessed per se. I mean, I certainly don't think that it's something that we should be reporting and commenting on our report statements. Same with the idea of producing the idea of global citizenship. I don't really necessarily think it's something that we need to be reporting on as an actual target grade. But I think we assess whether what we're doing is working by the engagement of our students in these discourses, the fact that students will start to feel comfortable having these sort of discussions with us, the fact that students start challenging these structures and start questioning these structures, the fact that we're providing a space where students can look at stereotypes, where students feel comfortable challenging what we're doing. I think that's success criteria, the engagement. Yeah, in terms of measuring the success of it, I'm not sure. Let's just see as time tells. I mean, this is something that we're bringing in terms of something we're actively doing with our students. We're looking to start it this academic year, and hopefully year on, students will become more comfortable actually challenging this, developing an awareness of this. So that's a very good question, not one I can particularly answer. I think lots of this is maybe still aspirational at this stage.
Is there an important role of intercultural learning in connecting community?
Absolutely. I don't know how we can connect communities truly connect communities without intercultural learning. I mean, there's a degree of communities sort of buying into this model. I mean, what I'm concerned about is the idea that sort of the Western education system is held as this gold standard. Globalized society being perceived as going hand in hand with this Western model of modernity. To be able to succeed on a global platform, you need to sort of get with the Western program. And this is what my research talks about, sort of the Western hegemony, the colonization of education. So I think communities can connect by buying into this Western dominant model. But I think for communities to genuinely connect, yes, we need intercultural learning. I mean, as I said, I've been overseas for 12 years, I think. And it really is only the past couple of years that I've truly started appreciating what good things can be learned. I think it's because I'm now looking through the eyes of my daughter, who, as I said, doesn't identify necessarily as British. Learning from other cultures, what that can do for me. My personality, my culture is certainly evolving, having been overseas. I'm certainly, British culture doesn't resonate with me. I go back to the UK now and it feels alien to me. And I think that's when communities start to truly connect, when we learn from each other, not being in denial. We're not all the same. You know, this is why the sort of equality model doesn't necessarily work. Different cultures have different needs. So yeah, I think intercultural learning is hugely important, particularly in a world that is globalizing, a world that is so interconnected. And it's being mindful that the learning goes both ways. It's not just a case of the world is becoming interconnected, therefore we want to westernize everyone. You know, we don't want this sort of saviour discourse. It's the idea of everyone learning from each other's culture. And I think every culture has got things to offer. Every culture has its own knowledge, and also enabling us to stop this subjugation of other cultures.
How do you motivate students who seem to be differently engaged?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And they've all been excellent questions, sorry, but that's one certainly. Yeah. The big one for me, I sort of have little pet projects, and the big one for me has been students being incredibly quiet in the classroom, and realising that closed questioning doesn't work. I would have the same handful of students, often my students from a more individualistic culture. I would have students giving answers, shouting out answers again, and sort of trampling over the more quiet, reserved students, something, as I alluded to, that I actually empathise with. So it's strategies for making students feel comfortable. Now, some students just will not feel comfortable speaking out in class. And I think actually saying to students, you must ask more questions. I've seen students come to me with their own targets, and their targets being, I'm going to ask questions in class. It's like, no, I don't want you sitting in class feeling nervous now that you've got this agenda that you have to be more vocal in class. It's finding ways to enable these questions to be asked in a safe way. So things like writing questions on post-it notes and leaving them on the desk, writing questions we have Google Docs of questions that students can pop their questions in during the lesson. Now we're moving towards e-learning. Yeah, as I said, I find sort of exit slips being quite a good idea, so a student can anonymously leave their questions on the board as they go. Yeah, just writing their questions in their book, so when you take the books into Mark, you can respond to their questions more privately, just facilitating ways that a student feels comfortable engaging in a way that suits them. I also find that just calling on a student doesn't necessarily work. Yes, it works in that student is now speaking out in class, but let's think about what you're doing to that student. You're potentially making that student anxious coming into your classroom, and that's not what we want to achieve. Now, I don't know if those of you teaching via Zoom have noticed that the chat function has been an epiphany. Students that don't seem to be very comfortable speaking out, once you make the chat function available, will happily type their questions, will happily have discussions via the chat function. So maybe that's something we can keep going.